George Atzerodt was part of John Wilkes Booth's cabal of assassins who were going to take out President Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet in a fiendish plot that was too complex to pull off. Booth, who was too smart for his own good, hatched his scheme while brooding in Mary Surratt's boarding house surrounded by half-witted alcoholics. George Atzerodt was born on June 12, 1835 in the Kingdom of Prussia. He immigrated to the United States in 1844 when he was 8 years old. His family settled in Germantown, Maryland, but later moved to Virginia. In early 1860, George and his brother John moved to Port Tobacco, Maryland, and opened up a carriage repair shop. But despite the business being somewhat successful, the brothers ended the partnership when John moved to Baltimore, leaving George in Port Tobacco. George, despite living in the United States since he was 8 years old, never became a naturalized citizen and had a hard time speaking English. But despite this, he became a rabid Confederate, and when the American Civil War broke out in 1861, he became part of a clandestine Confederate operation, helping Confederates cross the Potomac River. A few years later, in early winter of 1865, he became acquainted with John Surratt, a Confederate spy and courier who George was introduced to by another Confederate spy, Thomas Harmon, who talked about George's extensive knowledge of the back roads of Maryland and his skill as a boatman. Surratt needed a man with his expertise for when he pulled off their plan to kidnap President Abraham Lincoln. Surratt invited him to meet the plot's leader, John Wilkes Booth. George met Booth and Surratt at Surratt's boarding house in Washington, D.C., which was owned by Mary Surratt, John's mother. The plan was to kidnap President Lincoln on March 17, 1865. They were going to nab him and travel to Richmond, Virginia, with George guiding the way and delivering the president to the Confederate government and ransom him off in exchange for thousands of Confederate POWs and to stop the war. But the president's carriage never left the capital, ruining their plans. Booth, however, had a plan B. He was going to blow up the White House, but those plans would have to be tossed out the window due to the logistics, practicality, and being a terrible idea in general. Around this time, George was kicked out of the Surratt boarding house by Mary due to George's constant drinking and boorish behavior, which was too much for her to take. Booth, however, kept George around because he had a Plan C in mind and needed him to be part of the master plan to wipe out Lincoln's cabinet. John Wilkes Booth got his cabal of assassins ready to hit the three main targets of Lincoln's cabinet. John was going to assassinate the president at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14, 1865. Former Confederate soldier Lewis Powell was assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward, and George was to take out the Vice President Andrew Johnson. Other members were the drunken Edmund Spangler, who worked as a stagehand at Ford's Theater, who would help him come in and out of the building. Booth's childhood friend and former Confederate soldier Michael O'Laughlin, who worked with Booth on the Ford's Theater scheme and may or may not have been part of a plot to kill the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and David Harold, who supervised the roles of George and Powell, along with accompanying Booth on his escape from Ford's Theater. George was to assassinate Andrew Johnson, so he rented a room at the Kirkwood Hotel on the morning of April 14th. He asked for room 126, which was above Johnson's. The vice president stayed at the Kirkwood and was a well-known frequent guest at the hotel's bar. He started that day by drinking at the hotel bar and asked the bartender all kinds of questions about the daily activities of the vice president. His questions raised a few eyebrows amongst the patrons, and when the news of the president's assassination got around the following morning, a hotel employee alerted the authorities about a strange man hanging around the hotel asking a lot of weird questions. George never got anywhere near the vice president that night. He drank himself into a stupor and wandered the streets. An eyewitness saw him toss a knife into the gutter. George ran off to hide out with a cousin of his in Germantown. The authorities arrived at the Kirkwood after being alerted by a hotel clerk about the strange man who was asking all kinds of questions. They searched George's room and found a Bowie knife, a revolver, and John Wilkes Booth's bankbook. He was arrested 5 days later in Germantown, When he was in custody, George gave a confession to the Baltimore police, which was tossed out and was considered lost until 1977. And here it is, in his own words. James Wood, sometime called Mosby, boarded with Mrs. Murray, an Irish woman, on the corner of 9th and F Street in a 3-story house, front on upper end of the P.O. and south end of Patent Office, with basement entrance on left side going up 9th Street from Avenue. He was little over 6 feet, black hair, smooth round face, gray coat, black pant, and spring coat mixed with white and gray. Saw him last time on Friday evening about 5 o'clock with Booth. He sent for letters to the post office with James Hall. He was brought from New York. Surratt told me so. He said he had been a prisoner in Balti, near the depot. He was arrested for whipping a Negro woman. Mosby was Wood's nickname. Did not know him by any other name than mentioned. Gus Powell, now arrested in Old Capitol, was one of the party. He went also by name of Gustavus Spencer. Surratt and Spencer came from Richmond together just after it had fallen. James Donaldson, a low, chunky man, about 23 or 24 years of age, small-potted, dark complexion, deep, plain black suit. Only saw him one time, and this was Wednesday previous to the murder. He was having an interview with Booth and told him to meet him on Friday evening, and he replied he would, and left and went up to Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Treasury Building. I was under the impression he came with Booth. Arnold, O'Loughlin, Surratt, Harold, Booth, and myself met once at a saloon or restaurant on the avenue between 13th and 14th Street. The Samuel Thompson registered on the morning of the 15th April at Pennsylvania Hotel. I met him on way to hotel. He was an entire stranger to me. I left the hotel alone on the morning of 15th of April. A lieutenant in room 51 will prove this. Surratt bought a boat from Dick Smoot and James Bronner, living about Port Tobacco, for which they paid $300 and was to give $100 extra for taking care of it till wanted. Booth told me that Mrs. Surratt went to Surrattsville to get out of the guns which had been taken to that place by Harold. This was Friday. The carriage was hired at Howard's. I saved a man named Waitman who boarded at Surratt at post office. He told me he had to go down the country with Mrs. Surratt. This was on Friday. Also, I'm certain Dr. Mudd knew all about it, as Booth sent me liquors and provisions for the trip with President to Richmond about 2 weeks before the murder to Dr. Mudd's. Booth never came and never said until the last night that he intended to kill the president. Harold came to the Kirkwood house same evening for me to go see Booth. I went with Harold and saw Booth. He said he was going to kill the president and Wood, the Secretary of State. I did not believe him. This occurred in the evening around 7:30 It was dark. I took a room at Kirkwood's. Both Harold and I went to the room, left Harold's coat, knife, and pistol in the room, and never returned to it. Booth said during the day that the thing had failed and proposed to go to Richmond and open the theater. I am not certain, but I think I stayed one night at the Kirkwoods. We were to try and get papers to Richmond from Mr. Johnson. Booth spoke of getting the papers. He would get them out of the theater. Wood and Booth were apparently confidential with each other. Plenty of parties in Charles County knew of the kidnapping affair. One of the men, named Charles Yates, knew all about it. He went to Richmond during the winter, and he was to row the president and party over. Thomas Holborn was to meet us on the road and help in the kidnapping. Bailey and Barnes knew nothing of the affair unless Booth told Bailey and Barnes. Booth had met Bailey on C Street with me. I did not meet Booth or any of the other party in Baltimore on or about the 31st of March. Boyle also killed Captain Watkins near Annapolis last month. He was one of the party in the conspiracy. I repeat, I never knew anything about the murder. I was intended to give assistance to the kidnapping. They come to Port Tobacco several times and brought me to Washington. The pistol given me I sold or received on loan on a Saturday morning after the murder from John Caldwick at Matthews and Wells store, High Street, Georgetown. The knife I threw away just above Mrs. Canby's boarding house the night of the murder about 11 o'clock when I took my horse to stable. I had the horse out to help to take the president. I did not believe he was going to be killed, although Booth had said no. I heard of the murder. I ran about the city like a crazy man. I had not seen Arnold for some time, but saw old Laughlin on Thursday evening on the avenue at saloon near U.S. Hotel. He told me he was going to see Booth. Wood did not go to the street in the daytime for fear of arrest. When he came to Washington, he boarded at Surratt's. This was in February. He went to Booth last of February to New York. Booth, we understood, paid the way. I knew nothing about Canada. Wood told me he had horses in Virginia. Samuel, Arnold, and Mike O'Laughlin ought to know where the horses and pistols were brought. Sam and Mike have had a buggy and horse kept at stable in the rear of theater. Booth had several horses at the same place. I think the horse's property was in Surratt's name. I sold one of the horses and paid part of the money to Booth and part to Harold, who said he would see Booth about it. The saddle and bridle belonged to Booth is at Pennsylvania House, where I left it. I overheard Booth, when in conversation with Wood, say that he visited a chambermaid at Seward's house and that she was pretty. He said he had a great mind to give her his diamond pin. Harold talked about powders and medicines on Friday night at Mrs. Conby's. Wood, Harold, Booth, and myself were present. This was a meeting place because Wood could not go out for fear of arrest. Kate Thompson, or Kate Brown as she was known by both names, put up at National and was well known at Pennsylvania House. She knew all about the affair. Surratt went to Richmond with her last March, and Gustav Howell had made a trip with her to the same place. This woman was about 20 years of age, good-looking and well-dressed, black hair and eyes, round face, with South Carolina, and a widow. I did not see Surratt for 7 or 8 days before the murder, nor have I seen him since. Mrs. Thompson, or Brown, had 2 large light trunks, one much larger than the other. Young Waitman at Surratt's ought to know about this woman. This remark made by me in Baltimore on the 31st of March alluded to blockade running and privateering altogether, and Booth said he had money to buy a steamer and wanted me to go in it. I was to be one of them. In this way, I was going to make a pile of money. Booth said he had met a party in New York who would get the president, certain. They were going to mine the end of the president's house near the War Department. They knew an entrance to accomplish it through. Spoke about getting friends of the president to get up an entertainment and they would mix it in and have us serenade and thus to get at the president and party. These were understood to be projects. Bruce said if he did not get him quick, the New York crowd would. Booth knew the New York party apparently by a sign. He saw Booth give some kind of sign to 2 parties on the avenue who said they were from New York. My uncle, Mr. Richter, and family in Montgomery County, Maryland, knew nothing about the affair either, before or after the occurrence, and never suspected me of anything wrong, as I was in habit of visiting and working in the neighborhood and staying with him. My father formerly owned part of the property, now owned by Richter. George Atzerodt went to trial on May 1, 1865, for his role in the assassination of President Lincoln. His lawyer, Captain William E. Doster, tried to describe his client to the court. that he was a coward and he would never attempt to kill the vice president even if he was given the assignment because he was a coward at heart. Doster also said that George was guzzling like Falstaff at 10:15 p.m. This is around the time the president was assassinated, but the court didn't buy his excuse, and on July 7, 1865, George, along with Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, and David Harold, were hanged on the courtyard of the Washington Arsenal after they were found guilty in being part of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. His last words were, "May we all meet in the other world. God take me now." He is buried in the Glenwood Cemetery in Washington, D.C.